afternoon. I'm very happy to introduce Karen Livescu. Karen did her bachelor's degree at Princeton University, then continued to do a PhD at MIT, and then a postdoc at MIT, then received a position at the Technological Institute of Chicago and at the University of Chicago. She's researching speech and speech models, and she'll speak about models of word pronunciation based on human speech production.
Thanks. So thanks a lot for having me here. This is a kind of different forum for me to speak at, and I'm really excited. But also I know that there's a very broad audience here, so I hope that there's something for everybody here, but please stop me if you have any questions. Hopefully nothing here is too basic. I'm assuming very little background knowledge. So if something's not clear, stop me. If something is too clear, just kind of go like this, and I'll move on. So what we're talking about today is a topic that's really it's an engineering topic. I mostly deal with speech recognition as an engineering problem. But there's also scientific motivations and I hope scientific applications. So hopefully that will be clear, mostly at the beginning and at the end of the talk. And everything that I'm describing here is joint work with a number of people, both at TTI and outside of TTI, and I'll highlight each of these people as their work comes up. So just a little bit about TTI, because I know that most people here probably don't know it. The motto, Toyota Technological Institute, is a philanthropically endowed academic computer science institute dedicated to basic research and graduate education in computer science. So it's basically exactly what that sounds like. We're like an independent computer science graduate institute. We only offer PhD degrees. Our students are funded partly by the TTI grant endowment and partly by regular grants, just like any academic organization. We're located at University of Chicago, and we have an affiliation with the computer science department, but we have collaborations with CS, statistics, linguistics, chemistry, some of us. And in terms of size, at the moment we have 9 tenured or tenure-track faculty, about the same number of research faculty, 19 grad students, and a few other adjunct faculty and postdocs. We also have a summer internship program, so our student body tends to grow during the summer. And our most active research areas are machine learning. That's probably what we're best known for. Theory of computation, computer vision, speech technologies. That's me and one more faculty member, and computational biology. Okay.
How many are Israelis?
Oh yeah, good question. I don't know, but I can tell you I speak Hebrew most of the time.
About 5 that I know.
No, it's about half of the tenure-track faculty. Yeah, so about 5. And we try to maintain that, so if people here are interested in applying, I should have said we are still growing. We're going to grow by another about 50%, both in terms of faculty and grad students. It's a fairly new institute. Okay, so about the talk itself, I know that a few people here work in speech, and when you start to work in speech, pretty much anybody, as they start to work in speech, they're struck by the huge amount of variability in the signal. So I'll start by just introducing that. Here's a few examples of one word, excised from spoken sentences. They're all the same word. There was audio before. I wonder if... I just tested it. I wonder if because of this, it's...
No, it should work. Try it again, maybe your computer is the volume here. Probably.
Did you get all that? What was the word? Probably. Oh. That's no fair. So those were not doctored examples. Those were real examples excised from regular speech. And so as you can tell, there are very different ways of pronouncing it. And I think many of them are very hard to recognize. So what are the sources of variability? So first of all, there's acoustic variability. Different speakers, different acoustic channels, different acoustic environment, different background noise depending on where you're standing and so on. There are differences in prosody, which is the rate of speech, the volume, the intonation, when your pitch may go up, your pitch may go down, and that's schematically represented here by functions of something that you vary as you utter the words, and also pronunciation. So if I were to take each of those examples that I just played and ask a phonetician to very, very carefully transcribe them in terms of phonetic units, they might look something like this. I won't say too much about the label inventory, but you'll see a lot of examples like this. These are what we call phones, which are basically basic speech sounds, so vowels, consonants, and these are the types of labels that you might see if you look up a pronunciation in the Merriam-Webster dictionary or something like that. So our general approach in speech technologies to handling all of this variability is to take large data sets, take knowledge that we have from speech science and from linguistics. Is this not working very well?
This is better.
Okay, then I'm going to be, maybe I'll just forget about this. Knowledge that we have from speech science and from linguistics, which informs the structures of models that we assume to exist over the data. We use algorithms for machine learning to learn parameters of those models and parts of the structures of those models. And this allows us to do various tasks in speech technologies. I will mostly be relating to speech recognition, but other technologies as well. And then hopefully those technologies and those models may also inform us about something that we didn't know before about speech itself. And this is the architecture of a typical automatic speech recognizer. What I will be showing you is starting to build very atypical speech recognizers, but you should at least know what a typical one looks like. So usually what we do is we start with an acoustic waveform of a word or a sentence, and then we typically break it up into small windows, often at a skip of about 10 milliseconds, and then over each of those windows we compute a vector of some kind of acoustic features, typically something based on the spectrum of the signal over that window. And then after that point, this is our representation of the signal. It's just a sequence of these vectors. And the rest of the work is called decoding or search, where we search the space of possible hypotheses, possible word sequences or phone sequences that could possibly correspond to that acoustic signal to produce a recognized string. And the knowledge sources that go into doing this task are called the acoustic model, which relates, maybe I should start from the language model. The language model, which is the distribution over word strings and tells us essentially what are more likely or less likely word strings in this language. The pronunciation model, which relates words to subword units of some sort, like phones. And the acoustic model, which relates the subword units to the acoustics themselves. Okay? And all of these are typically trained with training data. So this is a very, very broad schematic. And in this talk, we'll mostly be concerned with the pronunciation model. So for the most part, I won't even have acoustics in the experiments that I show you. I'll just have subword units and words. Okay. So what can speech recognition do today? What kinds of tasks does it do well? What kinds of tasks does it do poorly? So what I'm showing here is as a function of time, this is year on the x-axis from 1988 to 2000-something, the error rates of speech recognizers on different tasks. So the y-axis is word error rate. Word error rate is when a speech recognizer produces a hypothesis, which is a sequence. We can align that sequence with the reference or the correct sequence and count the number of substitutions, insertions, and deletions divided by the number of correct words. And that's our word error rate. So this is something that can be higher than 100%.
But this is without using any lexicon.
This is...
Not using it to real words.
We are aligning the hypothesis to real words.
And an error is?
An error is when the word is incorrect.
The word is incorrect.
That's right.
Can be also the
That's right. That's right. That's right. But we don't even know when that's happened typically because the recognizer only produces words. Okay, and what I'm showing here is a set of benchmark evaluations that have been done by the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the U.S. They run these competitions, and typically they take a task, like in this case, dictating sentences from the Wall Street Journal, and let a bunch of speech labs try to run their recognizers on it, and they do that for a few years, and then typically when they start to do really well, they give up on the task and give us a harder task. So the lines never get very, very low. This is on a logarithmic scale. Around 1 to 4% is where people believe is the range of human error. That's a very, very rough estimate. Don't take it too seriously. So let's talk about a few kinds of speech recognition tasks. One task which is not even on this plot is digits, just recognizing continuous digits, which can be done at about less than 1% error rate for reasonably clean audio. Right, so that's very interesting. Humans tend to be very, very robust to things that make automatic speech recognizers fail.
No, but there's a big difference in human performance because if there's context that helps you, or if there's other things that is completely not included, or maybe included in the language model. So that's
right.
Not word error.
So that's why I say that this is very approximate, because typically humans have some advantages and some disadvantages relative to the machine. They might have context about what the conversation was about or something like that. So I don't think that's a very fair number.
There's no noise whatsoever.
There is in some of the tests. So I'm actually going to play examples. So here's an example of just connected digits.
15739.
Okay, so that's clean audio, connected digits, about less than 1% error rate. Wall Street Journal dictation, as I mentioned, sounds like this.
The banks that own Scandinavian Bank had to inject about $47.7 million of additional capital.
Okay, and that's done with about 5 to 10% error rates. Word error rates. Broadcast news, which is kind of a mix of dictation and interviews and field speech and things like that, sounds something like this.
But we'll also offer you a la carte if that's the way you prefer to purchase.
As convenient as these high-tech packages may be.
Okay, and that's recognized at about 10% by the state-of-the-art recognizers. Telephone conversations, sounds something like this.
Yeah. You can interpret the TV show in the same way you can interpret the Bible.
Okay. Sometimes people say really entertaining things.
It was very good telephone speech. This was not GSM or anything like that.
That does a regular landline. Yeah. And that's recognized by the top recognizers at about 20% error rate. And then finally, I don't have an example for this, but meeting speech, where you have multi-person meetings just sitting around the table, that's even more difficult. It's about 25 to 40% error rates, depending on various things. So what kinds of things vary from the easy things to the hard things? So many, many things vary, obviously. But the thing that I want to focus on here is that from here to here, we're going from more controlled and more formal speech to more informal speech. And people, when we speak informally, we tend to speak less, some might say clearly, some might say we speak sloppily. Generally, we speak less like the recognizer is expecting us to speak. Okay? So I refer to that as pronunciation variation. And so let me give you some concrete examples of what I mean by pronunciation variation. This is taken from conversational speech. This is taken from the same telephone speech corpus that I gave the example of before. By the way, will somebody tell me when I have something like 10 minutes left or 5 minutes left? I just realized I can't. Oh, okay. So I have until 6? Okay. Okay, so here are a few examples of words drawn from that database. There are 4 words here, probably sense, everybody, and don't. And they're dictionary pronunciations, so this is the canonical or correct pronunciation. And then all of the examples of actual pronunciation tokens of those words in this phonetically transcribed database as transcribed by expert phoneticians. The actual transcriptions have a little bit more detail than I'm showing here. They have all kinds of diacritics saying that this sound was a little bit different from expected. So I've simplified a little bit. The green numbers are the number of times that each of these pronunciations occurred. And let me just play a couple. This is probably.
Probably.
This is the word sense, and you might, I hope that you can hear that it sounds like there's a little extra T sound inserted towards the end of it.
Sense.
So it should have sounded, sure.
Sense.
It's hard over the room speakers, but it should sound like cents, like dollars and cents. And here's the word everybody.
Everybody.
So what you can see in all of these examples is that there's a huge variety. Any one of these pronunciations tend to occur very, very rarely. So if we were hoping to get some statistics over these tokens, it's pretty hopeless. And they tend to differ grossly from the dictionary pronunciation. It's very rare to actually see the dictionary pronunciation at all. Yeah.
These instances are taken from within longer utterances?
Yeah. So context will help you a little bit to disambiguate. Will help you a lot to disambiguate the word.
Do you include some prior probability for any of those words?
When you're doing a complete speech recognition task and you're recognizing sequences, then yes, you will recognize this word in the context of the previous word.
People do it a lot.
Yeah, of course. Okay, and those were just a few examples. Here's an idea of what the entire database looks like. Here I'm plotting the number of pronunciations per word as a function of the frequency of the word. So just an example, a word that occurs at least 50 times in the database tends to have, on average, about 35 distinct pronunciations. Okay, so it's really very, very, a very deep problem. And it's not just superficially a problem, it also does have a big effect on speech recognition performance. So if you look at words that were pronounced canonically versus words that were not pronounced canonically in the same set, the same data set, the words that are non-canonical are more likely to be misrecognized. And conversational speech is recognized at almost twice the error rate of dictated speech when you control for everything else. So this is an example of an experiment where the experimenters had subjects produce spontaneous conversations, and then they recognized these with a state-of-the-art recognizer. They got something like 50% error rate. Then they had the same speakers come back into the same room with the same microphone and just dictate their transcripts, just read the transcripts of the same things that they spoke, and that was recognized as 28% error rate. So this is more than just predictability, because this is exactly the same sequences of words. This is something about what's happening within the words when you're spontaneous versus dictated. And then just for fun, they also had the people try to pretend to be conversational while reading their transcriptions, and they got something like something intermediate between the dictated and the conversational word array. So there's something really about the style of speech. Okay, and what I want to say before actually launching into the main body of the talk is that pronunciation modeling, I'm presenting it as a part of the speech recognizer, but it's really central in all speech research, all branches of speech research. So what I mean by a pronunciation model is descriptions of words in terms of some kind of smaller subword units, such as phones, but they don't have to be phones. And so this is central in speech recognition, like I said, but also in phonetics, which analyzes how words are produced and how they sound acoustically in terms of these subword units. Psycholinguistics, which studies how these units are acquired by children and how units are differentially affected when there's a speech disorder. And so we know that both humans and machines do or must build words out of smaller subword units. But which subword units is not clear either for humans or machines, and how are they combined is unclear. So with that said, for the rest of the talk, I will describe the sort of standard approach that was in use until a few years ago, which is based on pronunciation modeling by breaking up words into phones. And I'll show how those kinds of models try to account for the pronunciation variability that we saw. And then I'll describe a couple of new models that we've proposed that are based on trying to represent what we know about speech production and what some linguists at least think that the knowledge that some linguists think humans use when they're perceiving words that are spoken in this way. So the first type of model will be a generative model that's generating all of the possible ways that a word can be articulated, and those will be represented as dynamic Bayesian networks. I'll define those when we get to them. And then the second type of model will be a discriminative model that uses both phonetic information and articulatory or production information, and those will be using large margin learning. And I know that in the abstract I said that I would talk about articulatory models for transcription, but looking over my slides, I decided that I will not have time for that, so I'm sorry, that's gone away. So we'll be talking about these two kinds of models, and the kinds of experiments that we're going to be talking about are word classification. So just if some phonetician were to give me those examples that we were just looking at, could I recognize the word? Okay.
So the basic assumption is that you must go through these subway units which are discrete and well defined. I mean, I had this discussion with your suggestion not long ago.
Okay.
Public, but I'm not going to repeat it. It's not essential to do it.
So I'm very happy to have that discussion, but maybe we should have it later. But yes, the assumption is that there are some units. I wouldn't necessarily say that they have to be discrete. They could be, say, trajectories, but I think, okay, I guess there is a discrete inventory of them. Within the units, there might be something continuous going on. Okay. So phone-based pronunciation modeling, which is sort of the standard approach, the way that it deals with the large numbers of pronunciation variants is to take the lexicon, or the pronouncing dictionary, and expand it with phonetic substitution, deletion, and insertion rules. So for example, remember the word sense that kind of sounded like sense? The way that might have been produced is, if you look up the word sense in the dictionary, here is its canonical pronunciation. We might have a rule that allows a T to be inserted in a certain context, and then that would give rise to the pronunciation that we saw. And in general, this kind of model uses a bank of these transformation rules of the form some U, it's referred to as an underlying phoneme in the dictionary, is produced as some S, some surface phone in the acoustics, given some left-hand context and some right-hand context with some probability. So an example is epenthetic stop insertion, which is what this is, where the null phone becomes a T in some context of a nasal and a fricative in this case. Yeah?
So is there a great deal of variance among the pronunciation of, say, a certain word by the same individual, or is it just a cusp?
Yes, yes. It tends to vary with everything, with predictability of the word, and at that particular point in the sentence, with speaking rate, with time of day, with mood. So what I'm talking about is not necessarily across speakers, but just across everything. Another typical effect that occurs is what's called flapping, which is something that happens to the sound T, and it's often pronounced like what phoneticians call a flap. So like we don't say butter, we say butter. That's a flap, and that can happen in many other types of words after a stressed vowel and before an unstressed vowel. And these rules can come either from linguistic knowledge. Many people, starting with Chomsky and even before, studied what kinds of linguistic rules of this type can occur. So we could use those, or we can learn these from data. And typically, the rules are represented as decision trees for various reasons. Decision trees that predict the distribution of possible sounds that could be produced by some target sound. So for example, this is a decision tree for the sound T. If we don't know anything about the context, then it has about 40% chance of being produced like a regular T, 30% chance of being produced like a T closure, like cat versus cat, 20% chance of being flapped, and so on. In the context of a previous stressed and a next unstressed vowel, then we're much more likely to have a flap and less likely to have the other sounds. Okay, so these are the types of models that are learned in these phone-based pronunciation models. And in terms of how they do, I'm just going to give you a sample of the literature on these models. So for various types of rule-based systems like this, and for various types of domains, broadcast news, conversational telephone speech, small vocabulary, weather queries. The impact on word error rate tends to be around between 1 to 3% improvement, okay? Which is, it's considered significant in the speech recognition community. These are very difficult tasks, very difficult to improve word error rate on them. So this is a good result, but it's nowhere near what we would hope for, considering that we're starting with 45% error rate, and humans do much, much, much better than that. So a number of people, including ourselves, start to think what's wrong with these kinds of models, and this gave rise to models that are based on speech articulation. So I'll go into the description of these models. What I'm presenting here is joint work with Sam Bowman, who was a student at University of Chicago, Preeti Jyoti, who's a student at Ohio State, and Eric Fosler last year, who is Preeti's advisor. So, and this is not just our idea. Many people have looked at articulatory quantities as subword units instead of phones, but we have a particular approach. So the issues that phone-based models have are A, sparse data. So as you saw, each pronunciation tends to be very, very rare. So it's very difficult to get good statistics. And also false homophony, so increased word confusability because the phonetic representation is very coarse-grained. So typically, you might, by introducing extra pronunciations to a word, some of those pronunciations might be shared with another word, and that makes words more confusable. So articulatory models are one way to alleviate these issues, and they're based on ideas, like I was saying, from linguistics, from articulatory phonology, autosegmental phonology, if people happen to be familiar with that. And some linguists will actually say that this is how humans recognize words, is by analyzing them into articulatory gestures and mapping those articulatory gestures back to our mental representation. I don't know if that's the case, but for our purposes, it's just a nice model to encapsulate the kinds of variation that we see. So instead of now having each word represented as a sequence of phones, we're now going to have multiple sequences of these articulatory features. And I'll define those in a moment. And the actual realizations of a word will stray from the dictionary pronunciation by these articulators going out of sync with each other and by not reaching the precise target that they should have reached. Okay? So what do I mean by articulatory features? I mean quantities that are related to states of the vocal tract. So the parts of the vocal tract that we care about are shown here. This is a mid-sagittal view, so you can see this is the nose, the lips, the teeth, the tongue. The glottis is where the vocal cords are. And so the quantities that we care about are the locations and the opening degrees of the lips, the tongue tips, and the tongue body, what the glottis is doing, whether the vocal cords are vibrating or not. And the velum, which is the soft palate in the back of your mouth that toggles whether air flows through the nose for a nasal sound or through the mouth for a non-nasal sound. Okay? And then it's not too critical what the exact values of these variables are, but I'm just showing them here so you can get a sense of the size of the state space that people talk about. So it's each of these quantities tends to be quantized into between 3 and 8 values. Okay, so now instead of phones, we will talk about n-tuples of these articulatory features. Everything clear so far? Okay. Yeah?
Means you also need another model to transfer from acoustic to this representation.
That's right. So in a phone-based model, I need a model that relates acoustics to phones. Now I need a model that relates acoustics to this representation. And actually, I should say that there are a lot of people working on that problem. And I won't even talk about that problem. But a lot of people work on that, and then not as many people work on what do you do once you have detected these things, and that's what we're working on. Yep.
So how many more parameters are realistic compared to the standard LBC or the Capsra?
So I don't think of this as a replacement for Capstra. Think of it as a replacement for the phone. Because the input will still be Capstra or LPC or whatever, right? This is just replacing the hidden discrete state of the model. So actually these models will have fewer parameters,
So you
because
see
we'll be
some
factoring the safe space.
smooth continuity, or it's not really continuous?
It's not continuous, but we will encode context in the models, context that tells us how these features depend on each other or on their own future and past values. Whichever? Okay. Okay, so in case you've never seen the speech articulators in action, I thought I would show you what they look like. So this is an X-ray video of a person articulating. Here are the lips, the teeth, some fillings, the tongue contour you can sort of see. This is the velum going up and down as the person toggles between nasal and non-nasal. The glottis is somewhere around here, but it's really, really hard to see it. So we don't really see that. This happens to be Ken Stevens. He's a very famous phonetician, and he's now in his 80s, so I guess the X-ray video didn't do too much harm to him. But we're not allowed to do this anymore. But let me turn on the sound.
Tech, for pen.
This is nonsense syllables, and then there'll be real
da,
sentences.
he, gi, he, ga, ya. Why did Ken set the soggy net on top of his deck? I have put blood on her 2 clean yellow shoes. Stop.
Okay, so this, to me, this shows how complicated the process of articulating speech is. And in the theories of articulatory phonology, what they're trying to explain is what happens when the articulators don't do exactly what they're intended to do. So I want to show you a few examples of pronunciation variation and think about how an articulatory account would account for them. So in the example that we saw before of sense, I'm going to teach you just a little bit about phonetics for those who don't know. So imagine that you've said the S-E-N part of the word, and you're about to produce the S. Okay, so you need to go from an articulatory configuration of an N to one of an S. So what are these configurations? So an N is a nasal sound, so the velum is down. It's a voiced sound, so the glottis is oscillating, and it involves a tongue closure. You put the tongue up against the back of your teeth, and you have a complete closure, so there's no airflow. The S, on the other hand, is a non-nasal sound, so the velum has to go from down to up. It's voiceless, so the glottis needs to open, and it involves a slight tongue opening. So in principle, if we're producing the dictionary pronunciation correctly, what happens is the brain goes, okay, now give me an S, and all of the articulators just spring into action and do all of these things. What might happen in actuality is the brain orders up an S, the velum and the glottis might respond right away, the tongue might take a little bit longer to get around to it, and the lips maybe even longer. So this is exactly what's happening in this example. If the tongue is just a little bit late to open, but all of the other things have happened, then you end up with a tongue closure, which is voiceless and non-nasal, which happens to sound like a T. Happens to be the configuration for a T. So this is what happens in an epenthetic stop closure. Now, a phonetic account would just say, well, a T is inserted, I don't know why. An articulatory account tells you why. That's one nice thing. It also makes a prediction about what that T is going to be like. It's probably going to be shorter than a regular T because it's just an after effect, a byproduct of the articulators being a little bit asynchronous, among other things. So in terms of the representation of these features, the dictionary pronunciation looks something like this. I won't go through the details. This is the phonetic representation, and this is the representation in terms of all of the features. And the variant that we saw was something like this. So all of the features were actually the exact same values that they should have been, but just some of these boundaries got shifted around a little bit. Okay. I had another example which I will skip. And there are more examples like that. This issue of asynchrony between the articulators is all over the place. Another common thing that happens is nasalization of vowels, where the velum changes state during a little bit too early. So you might get a word that doesn't have the nasal sound that it was supposed to have at all. It doesn't have an N, but just has what's called a nasalized vowel. And so in a phonetic account, this would be called a deletion, but really this is just a little bit of asynchrony between the articulators. Examples like the ones we saw before of the very, very reduced cases of probably and things like that, you might call a phone deletion, but in an articulatory account, you would call it just a reduction in the articulatory gestures. So in this case, the lips didn't close and open fully when they were supposed to. And then there are some much crazier things like phonetic exchanges between phones, which are also caused by very simple articulatory phenomena. So what I want to get out of this kind of example is that there's a very small number of phenomena that explain a lot of things. And what that translates to from an engineering perspective is fewer parameters that describe a very complicated model. And we like that because we don't have a lot of data to learn the models from. Okay, so any questions?
So the assumption that the brain actually sends signals like give me an S.
Well, that was a little bit of a caricature. And fortunately, since I'm an engineer, I don't have to be correct scientifically. I just have to improve the performance of the recognizer. But I hope that the models do inform something scientific eventually. So the models that I'm going to be showing now are using dynamic Bayesian networks. How many people are familiar with dynamic Bayesian networks? Oh, okay, good. So some. So I'll just give a brief definition. I hope it will be enough to follow everything. Dynamic Bayesian networks are a type of graphical model. And what they are is a directed graph representation of a distribution over a set of variables. So I assume that people do know variables and distributions. So you have some set of variables, and you represent them as nodes in a graph. And along with each node, we have its distribution given its parents in the graph. So this variable has no parents, so it's just got its marginal distribution. This variable has two parents, so we have its distribution given those two parents. And the set of edges in the graph, or the lack thereof, tells us something about the independencies among the variables in some rather complex way. It's not a direct mapping. And the joint distribution over all of the variables is a product of these local distributions, local conditional distributions on each node. A dynamic Bayesian network is a Bayesian network that also happens to have a repeating structure. So this is useful for modeling stochastic processes where you have the same variables repeating over time. And an example, a very simple example of that you might know is a hidden Markov model, where you have two variables at each time point, and which we call a frame. The variables are the state and the observation. And so in a hidden Markov model, the conditional distributions are the probability of the state given the previous state, and the probability, and those are the transition probabilities, and the probability of the observation given the state, and those are the emission probabilities. And then the joint distribution defined by a hidden Markov model is just the product of all of these over all time, for however many frames we have in the signal.
And where does the Bayesian network get in?
So this is a Bayesian network. This is a dynamic Bayesian network. It's just a simple example because I thought people may know, there might be some people who know HMMs but don't know dynamic Bayesian networks. So this is for those people.
It doesn't show the relation between variables which are different articulatory.
Yeah, this is just a hidden Markov model. This is not an articulatory model. This slide has nothing. It's just background. So one of the nice things about graphical models, like Bayesian networks, is that they have uniform algorithms for doing a lot of things. Among other things, for finding the most likely values of some of the variables which are hidden, given other variables which are observed. So for HMMs, the instantiation of that algorithm is called the Viterbi algorithm. There are also standard algorithms for learning the model parameters, for example, expectation maximization. So that's just a bit of background to help interpret the next slide, because now I'm going to show a much more complicated dynamic Bayesian network. So this is one of our articulatory models shown as a DBN. So what I'll be showing is all of the variables in the model for two frames of speech. So let me start. You're going to see kind of two columns of variables. and each corresponds to something like 10 milliseconds of speech. And in each one, we're going to keep track of the current word that is being uttered. State indices for each of the articulators. So in this case, I'm showing 3 articulators, but there could be any number. Here I'm showing lips, tongue, and voicing. And what the state index is just an ordinal index into the pronunciation of the word. So if the word has 10 targets for each articulator, then this would go from 1 to 10 as we utter the word. And for each articulator, given the word and the current state index, we know what the target position should be. And that's given just by a dictionary. That tells us for that word, for this index, and this articulator, what should its value be. And then, like I said, we don't necessarily, each articulator doesn't necessarily hit its target. What we actually observe is the actual position of the articulator for each of the articulators. And that might be given by a distribution. So given that we have a certain target, we have perhaps a distribution that looks something like this over the possible values. So if the target, if this is lips and the target was closed lips, then perhaps 70% of the time the lips actually are closed, 20% of the time they're critically closed, which means there's some turbulent airflow across the lips. 10% of the time there's a narrow opening, and so on. So that this kind of these distributions account for reductions in articulatory gestures, and then we also need to account for the relative asynchrony of the articulators, and we do that with these variables that I'm calling sync. So sync lips tongue controls the amount of asynchrony between the lips and the tongue. Sync tongue voicing controls the asynchrony between tongue and voicing. And without going into details, I'll just say that the distribution of this variable controls how likely these indices are to differ by a certain amount. Okay, so one articulator might be producing the next target while another articulator is still in the last target. That kind of effect. So this is what I'll call a context-independent model, where the actual position of the articulators doesn't depend on any context other than the target for that articulator. But we can add context to these models by adding dependencies between various context variables and the positions of the articulators. And I'm not showing what those are, but there are various context variables that we might have, like the previous target, the next target, different articulators, targets, and so on. And we can introduce that context in a very similar way to the way that people used to introduce context in phone-based models with decision trees. So we can have a decision tree that encodes the distribution of this variable in different, given different values of the context variable. Okay? Question?
So you're treating it as a generative model?
Yes.
How many parameters more or less?
So in this first model without the context, it's hundreds. With the context, it varies depending on the context. But maybe thousands, not more than that. So one thing that I should say just for historical context, when I started to work on this was actually during my PhD thesis, and at the time, virtually all speech recognition algorithms were generative. So what we were going for was a pronunciation model that we can just stick into a regular speech recognizer, which was generative. So we have a generative language model, we would stick in our generative pronunciation model, and then connect that to a generative acoustic model. These days there's a much broader wealth of discriminative models that people use, so that has motivated the next set of models that I'll be presenting. Okay, so let me get into some experiments. So remember, our whole life right now is just some phonetician is going to give us one of these word transcriptions, and we're going to try to guess the word. And so that's the type of experiment we're going to set up. So we get this kind of input. We're going to convert it to articulatory feature values. That's a slightly noisy conversion because sometimes we don't know all of the values, but that's okay. We'll live with that. And then these will become observations of these variables, of the actual articulatory positions, and we're going to try to predict the word. So now we've turned it into a standard Bayesian network inference problem. So for every word in the vocabulary, we can compute its probability given the observed articulatory features. That gives us a rank list of the words in the dictionary, and we can output the most likely word. Or we can look at the entire ranking, depending on what we want to do afterwards. But I'm just going to show the accuracy of the most likely word that comes out of this. So here's the types of word error rates that we see. All of these yellow bars are various phone-based models. The blue ones are articulatory models. And I'm just going to go in order because I think each one is interesting for various reasons. So the first model that we look at is just a really basic, just a dictionary of what are called base forms, just canonical pronunciations. And that model, and then this axis is the error rate. That model has almost a 60% error rate, which is not too surprising when you consider that fewer than half of the words are produced according to the dictionary. So you wouldn't expect a dictionary to do very well. Then we took a bunch of linguistic rules that had been developed in a particular speech research group for a particular type of recognizer, but they're linguistic rules for the most part put together by phoneticians, and added all of those to the lexicon. And that only gave us about a 3% improvement, which was a little bit of a surprise that all of this work had gone into these very complicated linguistic models, and all we could squeeze out of them was 3% improvement on this task. Then we said, well, maybe that's not fair. Those rules were not really intended for this kind of very challenging task. Let's just throw... Oh, no, I'm sorry. These are just phonetic rules. Like T's can flap and T's can get inserted and those kinds of rules.
It's not really surprising. I mean, similar things happened on trying to insert higher level linguistic rules and they've never succeeded.
I guess we were hoping for a little bit more. So then we said, well, why don't we just throw in all of the pronunciations that we saw in the training set? And that's what this bar is. And that does quite a bit better, but it still gets almost 50% error. And then we took our implementation of a state-of-the-art phone-based model, which is using decision trees with many, many context variables, and that gets down to about 32% error. And then we looked at two articulatory models. One is context-independent, where we don't have any context on the articulatory feature values, and that gets about 40%, which is better than all of the phonetic models except for the very context-dependent ones. And with context in the articulatory models, we do about 3% better than the best phone-based model. So at this point, we were pretty happy. We had done better than the best phone-based model that we could come up with. But we can do better. So that takes us to the next model, which is a discriminative model. So this is work done with Hao Tang, my student at CTI, and with Yossi Keshet, who was a student here, so maybe a lot of you know him. He was a student of Yoram Zinger's, and now he's also faculty at CTI. And so Yossi is very active in doing large margin learning approaches for various problems in speech. And we thought that pronunciation model, the task that we have is very appropriate for that, because there are a lot of sources of variation, and we should be able to learn them in a task-specific way. So let me give you the problem setting. The problem setting is that we're given a phonetic string, P bar, from the set of all possible phonetic strings. And we want to predict the word. So this is the exact same problem as before. And our prediction is going to be W hat. Will be a function of this phonetic string. And F is a function that we're going to learn from some training pairs. Okay. So far, there's nothing different between this and what we've done before. We're just going to learn a different kind of function. And we're going to measure performance by 0-1 loss. If W hat is correct, our loss is 0. If it's incorrect, it's 1. And we're going to only consider functions of this form. They're argmax over all of the words in the vocabulary of some linear score. Okay, this is a dot product between two vectors, a vector of weight, theta, and a vector of what are called feature functions, which are functions over the phone sequence and the word. Okay, and the feature functions can be anything. They can be arbitrarily complex. So it's not so restrictive that this is a linear function because all of the interesting stuff happens in the features. And the only really desideratum for these functions is that they should be somehow correlated with whether there's a good fit between this string and this word. Okay? And this is a standard learning approach. And how do we actually do the learning? What does it mean to do learning? It means to learn these weights. Okay? So our tasks are to learn the weights and to somehow design good feature functions. So the way we do the learning, ideally we would like to minimize the expected loss on our tasks, the expected 0-1 loss, where expected is over some distribution over the data that we don't know. And this notation is just an indicator function. So this is just our 0-1 loss. And since the 0-1 loss is a very unpleasant function, it's non-smooth, non-convex, we, like everybody else, use a surrogate to that loss. We use the Hinge Loss, which looks something like this. It depends on the prediction that we've made as well as the correct answer. And we want to find the theta that minimizes the average of this loss now instead of our actual target loss. And we're going to add another little twist. We're going to regularize the loss, which means that rather than just minimizing this average, we're going to minimize the average plus the norm of our weight vector times some parameter lambda. This parameter lambda is what's referred to as a regularization parameter. It just trades off between accuracy on the training data versus generalization of the model. And the particular learning algorithms that we use several. One is Pegasus. It's a standard learning algorithm. It's a stochastic learning algorithm based on a subgradient calculation, and it was developed in part by Shai Shalev-Schwartz, who's in the CS department here. We also use the passive-aggressive algorithm by Kobe Kramer et al., which is also it's an online approach, and the reason we use it, so it doesn't come with as nice guarantees as Pegasus, but it can be shown to have an average loss which is comparable to the solution that we want, and it tends to empirically work a little bit faster. So that's why. 5 minutes? Okay. And also for comparison, we use another popular loss function, the log loss, which is, if people are familiar with conditional random fields, we basically do conditional random field learning. In all of these are all iterative learning algorithms. We iterate over the training data several times. Each of those is referred to as an epoch, and we tune that number and a regularization parameter on some held out data. I think I'm going a little bit fast over these things, so if anything was unclear, maybe come back to it at the end. I want to say a few words about the feature functions that we use, because that's where all of the interesting stuff happens. This is where we try to throw in all of the knowledge that people who've been doing pronunciation modeling over the past 20 years have come up with. So our first set of feature functions is just a count of the number of times that certain subsequences occur in the phonetic sequence. Okay, so we want to say for a given word, it's more or less likely that we'll see the sequence ba once or twice when that word is pronounced. It's a very, very rough kind of thing, and some subsequences are more discriminative than others in the sense that some are seen in all of the words and some are only seen in some words. So what we do is we borrow these features from the information retrieval community, term frequency, inverse document frequency. So we're basically treating our task as a query into the database of words, and we treat each word as a document and each of these subsequent n-grams as a word. And that gives us, and we multiply together this frequency of the n-gram with this discriminative measure of the n-gram. And that gives us our first feature function. We also have very, very basic feature functions that just measure how much the length deviates from the dictionary length of the word, and whether or not the sequence that we see is itself a dictionary pronunciation of some word. And then we do something that looks just like phone-based pronunciation modeling, which is we do a dynamic programming alignment of the sequence that we see with the sequence in the dictionary, and we count numbers of deviations of substitutions, insertions, and deletions, and that becomes another feature of our model. And if we just had that feature, it would be like discriminative learning of a standard phone-based model. And then we also use the articulatory DBN to do another alignment. It's a much more fine-grained alignment that tells us for each articulator what was its target, what was its actual value, what was the state index, and then we measure quantities that are analogous to the factors in the DBN. And those become articulatory feature functions. And those are, very, very quickly, those are all of our feature functions. And the good news is that this kind of combined model does way better than all of the others that we had tried before, almost half the error rate of the models that we tried before.
And you did two different things together.
Yeah.
Move to discriminative learning and then use a lot more features.
That's right. So we're actually, these results are only a few weeks old, so we're kind of in the process right now of trying to tease apart what kind of gain do we get from which aspect of the model. So one thing that we did is look at different learning algorithms, and we see that we do get a lot from the large margin aspect. It does do better than, say, CRF learning. There are some, to me, very interesting implementation details, but I won't get to that. We also compare different feature functions, and we see whether switching in or out some of these feature functions, how much of an effect it has. So, for example, the DP features, the dynamic programming phonetic features, which are kind of emulating a regular phone-based model, just those features with discriminative learning get you 22.7, which is already a lot better than we were doing with any of our models before. So that tells us that just discriminative learning alone is doing a lot for us here. And then... yeah, that's right. There's no guarantee at all. It's just approximating the joint distribution. Okay, so I know I'm running out of time, so I'll summarize, but I'm happy to answer more questions later. What hopefully I've convinced you of is that articulatory models, in the first part, articulatory models allow for a parsimonious representation as well as a detailed representation of pronunciation variation. As a nice bonus, it is related to what linguists believe we do, but we don't know whether that theory is correct. Articulatory models, generative articulatory models, outperform standard phone-based models on this word classification task. And with context modeling and discriminative learning, we improve a lot more. How much from each of these things remains to be seen. We have some ongoing work on all of these directions. Of course, we want to extend the approach to a complete end-to-end speech recognizer that relates to acoustics, as well as producing word sequences and not just single words. These are fairly straightforward extensions, but there's a lot of engineering challenges there. As far as the acoustic side goes, we're working on articulatory classification from acoustics. We're also working on learning better acoustic features that are more predictive of articulatory features. And kind of out of left field, we've also learned that linguists believe, this is work we're doing together with University of Chicago, linguists believe that very similar articulatory models apply not only to spoken languages, but to sign languages. And so we've gotten into applying these same models to sign language recognition. Very excited about that work, but there's not really major results to tell you about. Future directions, there are lots of applications for this outside of speech recognition: articulatory speech synthesis, audio-visual recognition and synthesis, cleaning up speech signals using articulatory constraints, and like I said, sign language interpretation and generation. And finally, another very exciting thing to me is whether models like this can contribute to our understanding of speech science. So far, we've just been using speech science, but perhaps we can use these kinds of pronunciation models to actually learn something about speech. So for example, when we look under the hood of these models, they actually tell us what they think the articulators are doing and what the targets were at different points in time. And we can learn from that things like how much asynchrony, how much articulatory reduction can occur. Does it depend, to what extent does it depend on context, on speaker, on speech disorders? And how do the model scores or judgments relate to human perception? So we can do kind of very similar experiments to what have been done with human perception on these kinds of models and see whether making various changes to the models correlates with what humans do. And this is something that we're also discussing with University of Chicago linguists. Very happy to be at University of Chicago for that reason. So I think I'll stop there. And thank you again for your attention and questions. Yeah. We do assume that the structure is known, and we only learn the parameters. Medium. I mean, it's more challenging than standard speech recognition because it's a more complex model. But there are actually some constraints in the model. There are some deterministic constraints that allow us to constrain the search space. So the truth is that if we just take a standard inference algorithm off the shelf from some toolkit, it does very poorly. But with just a little bit of intelligent use of constraints in the model, we can speed it up by a lot. This is the inference, which is part of the EM. So the EM is just EM. The real problem is the inference, and that's what I'm talking. That's what you can speed up with these constraints.
So what's state of the art maybe?
No.
My experience with recognizer is that they promise 20%, and then those 20% only work on the same data set, and then they can only, well, forget about my accent, but they're on different data sets, they crash. So can you comment on that or say something?
Yeah, sure. So it depends on what you mean by same. They will degrade more or less gracefully depending on how far away you are from the types of training data that it has seen. But there are algorithms for adapting speech recognizers explicitly. So if you know that you're going to be different, or if you might be very different from the training data that it has seen, it can adapt more quickly to the new speech than just retraining the entire model. So, for example, a typical type of experiment is where you have hundreds or thousands of hours of training data for some speaker-independent recognizer, and you have a specific speaker that might be quite different, and you only need less than a minute of their speech to adjust the parameters of the recognizer to get close to as good performance on the new speaker's speech. But you have to do that explicitly. Out of the box, they're very poor. But I think that, to be fair, I think that humans do this too, right? If you are suddenly forced to hear speech from some very new accent that you've never heard before, it might take you a while before you do a good job, but probably not as long as a speech recognizer does.
One last question. I was curious about this going back from the articulatory model to the acoustic features.
Yeah.
It's really nice because I really believe the whole thing works in a loop. The real acoustic features should be somehow relevant for the articulation. So how different are these new features from the standard?
Right. You're talking about like the features that we're learning now to be more predictive.
Yeah.
So we've started those experiments. So far, we've only done something very constrained, which is to learn to take a very, very long vector of standard acoustic features and then learn a transformation of those, a linear transformation typically. At this point, we're doing kernelized versions of it as we speak. So. No, I wouldn't say the complexity. But yeah, I mean, a very typical thing that speech recognizers are already doing is to take a very, very long feature vector and do some kind of dimensionality reduction. But that dimensionality reduction doesn't know anything about articulation. So when we do it so that it's predictive of articulation, and then we get something which is better than hopefully better than without knowing anything about the articulation. And when we do that, we only have to know the articulation at training time. We don't have to have it at test time. So that's the key thing. Hopefully next time I'll have more to say about kernels.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.